The gun was already pressed against Marcus Sheridan's temple when Violet Crawford stepped onto the porch of the Dusty Creek jailhouse and said the words that would change both their lives forever. "Let him speak." Sheriff Dale Holt turned his head slowly, the barrel of his Colt never wavering from the side of Marcus's skull. 3 other men flanked the sheriff, hands resting on their holsters like coiled springs, and every soul in the town of Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, had gathered in the dusty street to watch what they believed would be the last moments of the most wanted outlaw in 3 counties. Marcus Sheridan was on his knees in the dirt, his wrists bound behind him with rough rope, his dark hair matted against his forehead with sweat and dried blood. He had ridden into town alone, unarmed, hands raised above his head, and every person who witnessed it had assumed he was either the bravest man alive or the most foolish. The posters nailed to every telegraph pole and saloon door bore his name in bold black letters and listed crimes that made grown men flinch: bank robbery, train robbery, assault, the rumored murder of Deputy Roy Callahan outside of Las Cruces 2 winters ago, though that particular charge was printed with a question mark even on the official wanted notice, because the truth of it had never been fully established. And yet here he was, kneeling in the dirt, and he was not fighting. He was not running. His gray eyes, the color of storm clouds rolling in over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, were fixed not on the sheriff, not on the armed men surrounding him, but on Violet Crawford, who stood on the porch in her plain blue dress with her dark auburn hair pinned up under a sun-bleached bonnet, her hands gripping the porch railing so hard her knuckles had gone white. "Let him speak," she said again, and her voice did not tremble. "Miss Crawford," the sheriff said, his voice tight with the particular brand of warning that men in authority reserved for women who dared step into matters that did not concern them, "I would ask you kindly to go back inside." "You would ask me kindly," Violet repeated, and something in her tone made even Dale Holt pause. She descended the 2 porch steps and walked into the street, the hem of her dress sweeping through the dust, until she stood close enough to the kneeling man that she could see the precise shade of his gray eyes and the way his jaw was set with a tension that was not fear but something far more complicated. She looked at Marcus Sheridan for a long, searching moment, and then she looked up at the sheriff. This man rode into town unarmed with his hands raised. He has not resisted. He has not threatened anyone. The least you can do is let him say whatever it is he came to say before you put a bullet in him or drag him off to hang. The crowd murmured. There were women among them who pressed their hands to their mouths and men who exchanged uncertain glances. Violet Crawford was not the kind of woman anyone in Dusty Creek argued with. She ran the town's only school. She had nursed half the population through the cholera scare of 1882, and she had a way of speaking plain truths that made people feel both corrected and grateful for it. She was not a woman who inserted herself into situations without cause, and so when she inserted herself into this one, people paid attention. Dale Holt lowered his gun by 2 inches. It was not much, but it was something. Marcus Sheridan looked up at Violet Crawford and said the words he had ridden 300 miles to say. "I am sorry," he said, "for all of it, and I need to tell the truth about Roy Callahan before they hang me for something I did not do." The silence that followed those words was the kind that had weight to it, the kind that settled over a crowd like a second skin. And in that silence, Violet Crawford made the decision that would cost her everything she had built in Dusty Creek and give her something she had never allowed herself to want. She said, "Then come inside, and someone fetch the circuit judge." To understand how Marcus Sheridan came to be kneeling in the dust of Dusty Creek with his life hanging by a thread thinner than spider silk, and how Violet Crawford came to be the only person in that town willing to catch that thread and hold it, you had to go back almost 4 years, to the winter of 1880, when Violet first arrived in New Mexico territory with a teaching certificate from the Missouri State Normal School, a small leather trunk containing everything she owned. and the kind of quiet determination that forms in a person after they have survived enough hardship to know that the worst that can happen rarely kills you outright. Violet had grown up in the hill country of southern Missouri, the second of 5 children belonging to a minister father who preached forgiveness on Sundays and practiced very little of it the rest of the week. She had watched her father judge and condemn with the same breath he used to proclaim mercy, and it had left her with a profound distrust of condemnation without evidence and a fierce belief in the right of every person to be heard before judgment was passed. It was not a popular philosophy in the West, where justice was often faster than understanding, but Violet carried it the way she carried her teaching books, pressed close to her chest, unwilling to set it down regardless of the weight. She had come to Dusty Creek because a letter from the Territorial Board of Education had offered her the position of schoolteacher at a salary of $30 a month, and because the distance from Missouri suited her purposes exactly. There was a man in Missouri, a man she had been expected to marry, a man who had turned out to possess a dark past so thoroughly concealed beneath a pleasant face that discovering it had nearly broken her. She had not been broken. She had gathered herself and she had left. Dusty Creek was a town of about 300 souls in 1880, situated along a dry creek bed that flooded spectacularly in the spring and cracked to pale dust by August. It had a general store run by the Holbrook family, a saloon called the Prairie Star, a small adobe church, a telegraph office, a livery stable, a blacksmith, and the jailhouse that doubled as the sheriff's office and sleeping quarters. The school was a single-room building at the east end of the main street with 8 wooden desks, a cast-iron stove, and windows that let in more wind than light. Violet had made it hers. She had patched the windows with oilcloth, convinced the Holbrook family to donate a new stove after the old one cracked, and had 22 students enrolled by the spring of 1881, ranging in age from 6 to 14, including 3 Apache children whose parents worked at a nearby ranch and who had been told in uncertain terms by the previous teacher that the school was not for them. Violet had personally walked to the ranch and invited the families herself. It had caused a scandal. Violet had weathered it. She had been in Dusty Creek for nearly 3 years by the autumn of 1883, which was when she first heard the name Marcus Sheridan spoken out loud, in the way that people speak the names of those who exist at the edges of civilized territory, with a mixture of dread and reluctant fascination. The story, as Violet heard it pieced together from various sources at the general store and the church social, was this. Marcus Sheridan had grown up in the Texas Panhandle, the son of a rancher who had lost his land to a crooked land agent and a bank that had engineered the foreclosure through fraud. His father had died of a stroke brought on, people said, by the grief and humiliation of watching everything he had built disappear into the hands of men who had never put a single day's work into the soil. Marcus had been 20 years old at the time, with a younger sister named Clara to look after and nothing but a horse, a saddle, and the kind of anger that comes from watching a profound injustice go entirely unaddressed. He had started stealing from the bank that took his father's land. That much everyone agreed on. The first robbery was methodical and targeted, and the money was never traced because Marcus had used it quietly, paying off debts of other small ranchers who were facing the same orchestrated scheme from the same land agent. It was the kind of story that people in the territory liked, the kind that grew into legend. So by the time the truth was buried under the legend, you could no longer quite find it. What was not legend was the series of robberies that followed over the next 3 years, some attributed to Marcus and some merely suspected, and the company he had begun to keep as necessity and circumstance pulled him deeper into a world that had fewer and fewer exits. The gang he eventually rode with was led by a man named Cutter Voss, and Cutter Voss was not the kind of man who shared Marcus's original grievance or his original restraint. Cutter was simply a criminal, efficient and remorseless, and riding with him had carried Marcus further from whatever shore he had once stood on than he had perhaps intended to go. The death of Deputy Roy Callahan 2 years earlier was the charge that had transformed Marcus from a wanted outlaw into a hunted one. Roy Callahan had been well liked, a young man of 26 with a wife and a newborn son in Las Cruces, and his death had ignited a fury in the territorial lawmen that made every other charge against Marcus Sheridan feel minor by comparison. $1,000 reward had been posted. Posses had ridden out from 3 different counties. What the posters did not say, what the posses did not know, was that Marcus Sheridan had not pulled the trigger on Roy Callahan. Cutter Voss had. Marcus had ridden away from the gang the same night, sick with what he had witnessed and incapable of remaining part of it. But his name was already on the deed of that crime in the minds of every lawman in the territory, and the truth was buried under a story that Cutter Voss had carefully constructed to point every finger away from himself, and at a man who was no longer around to contradict it. Marcus had spent 2 years in the silence of that exile, moving between small towns and lonely stretches of desert, doing work where he could find it under names that were not his own, haunted by the specific weight of a crime he had not committed but could not disprove, and the broader weight of everything he genuinely had done, which was considerable. He had stolen. He had ridden with men who hurt people. He had made choices, each one feeling at the time like the only choice available, that had added up to a life he barely recognized. He had decided, sometime in the summer of 1884, that he would not let Roy Callahan's name be permanently attached to his own without a fight. Not because he expected to survive the attempt to clear it, but because the deputy had a wife and a child, and they deserved to know the truth, and because Marcus had run long enough that stopping felt like the only form of honesty left to him. He had chosen Dusty Creek because the circuit judge, a man named Harlan Bryce, was scheduled to come through the town in October of 1884, and because Dusty Creek was far enough from the center of the territorial marshal's operations that a man might make it there without being shot off his horse before he reached the street. He had not counted on how afraid the town would be when he arrived. He had not counted on how quickly Dale Holt would reach for his gun, and he had not counted on Violet Crawford. Inside the jailhouse, with the door pulled shut against the crowd and 2 of Dale Holt's deputies standing rigid against the wall, Marcus Sheridan sat across a scarred wooden table from Violet Crawford and tried to find the words for things he had never said out loud. She had brought him water. That was the first thing she did, before she asked him a single question, before she judged or assessed or calculated. She simply put a tin cup of water on the table in front of him and sat down. He had looked at the cup for a moment like he was not entirely sure it was real, and then he had drunk from it with the methodical care of a man who had learned not to waste anything. "The circuit judge will be in town in 8 days, Violet said. "Sheriff Holt has agreed to hold you here rather than transfer you to the marshal's office in Santa Fe, at least until Judge Bryce can hear what you have to say. I want you to understand that agreement is provisional and fragile, and that there are men in this town who would prefer to see you hanged from the livery beam tonight rather than wait 8 days. "I know," Marcus said. "Do you understand why I asked them to wait?" He looked at her directly for the first time since they had sat down, and Violet felt the full weight of that gray gaze and recognized in it something that surprised her. Not cunning, not manipulation. The thing she saw in Marcus Sheridan's eyes when he truly looked at her was a desperate, exhausted sincerity, the kind that belongs to a person who has been carrying a secret so long it has become a physical burden. "Because you believe that everyone deserves to be heard," he said, and then with a faint note of wonder, "or you are curious." "Both," Violet said honestly. "Tell me about Roy Callahan," he told her. He told her all of it, not in the practiced way of a man who has rehearsed his defense, but in the stumbling, uneven way of a man who has never told the whole truth of a thing out loud before. He told her about the night outside Las Cruces, about the ambush on the road that had not been planned to end in bloodshed, about the deputy who had come out of the darkness with his gun already drawn, about Cutter Voss drawing and firing before Marcus's mind had even fully processed what was happening. He told her about the sound the shot made, and the way Roy Callahan had gone down, and the way Marcus had sat frozen on his horse for 5 full seconds while Cutter Voss turned and looked at him with an expression that was almost like satisfaction. "I rode away that night," Marcus said. "I did not help. I did not go to the deputy's aid, though I told myself it was because there was nothing I could have done. The truth is I was afraid and I ran." He paused. "I have run a great many things I should have stood and faced." Violet was quiet for a moment. The lamp on the table between them threw amber light across the planes of his face, and she studied him the way she studied her students when she was trying to understand which particular variety of struggle she was looking at. She had grown skilled at reading the difference between a lie and a complicated truth, and what she heard in Marcus Sheridan's account was a complicated truth, layered and self-incriminating in ways that a fabricated story rarely was. A man constructing a lie to save his neck would not have included the part about sitting frozen on his horse. "Can you prove any of this?" she asked. "There is a man named Samuel Dries who was riding with us that night," Marcus said. "He split from Cutter's gang about 6 months after I did. Last I heard he was working a copper mine outside of Silver City. He saw what happened. Whether he will say so is another matter." He met her eyes again. "I am not asking to walk free, Miss Crawford. I have done enough that I do not expect that. I am asking for the truth of Roy Callahan's death to be on record somewhere that his family can find it." Violet looked at him for a long time. The lamp flame shifted in a draft from the poorly sealed window, and the shadows moved across both their faces. "I will write to Silver City tonight," she said. "If Samuel Dries is there, someone will know him." Marcus stared at her. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you do that?" "Because the truth matters," Violet said, in the tone of a woman who has said this particular thing many times and never fully gotten used to the fact that people find it surprising. "And because you rode 300 miles and walked into a town full of people who want you dead in order to say it. That deserves something." She stood and he stood too, out of an instinct toward courtesy that seemed almost out of place given the circumstances and the handcuffs, and for a moment they were standing close enough that she could see the thin scar along his jawline, and the way his shirt collar was frayed at the edge but the fabric beneath was clean, the mark of a man who had been neglected by circumstance but not by his own nature. "You should sleep," she said. 8 days is not very long, and there is a great deal to do." She left him in the care of Dale Holt's deputies and walked home through the dark street, her footsteps quiet on the packed earth, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that her hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear, from something she did not yet have a name for. The next morning, Violet sent her letter to Silver City via the Hallbrook store, where the postmaster also operated. Then she walked to the jailhouse and asked to see the prisoner again, and Dale Holt looked at her with an expression that mixed exasperation and something approaching resignation. "Miss Crawford," he said, "you know I respect you. But this man has been wanted by the territorial marshal for 2 years. If he hangs, you are not going to be able to make it right by having been kind to him." "I am not trying to make anything right," Violet said calmly. "I am trying to ensure that the thing that ultimately happens to him is based on actual facts rather than unchallenged accusations. That seems to me to be the minimum standard we should hold ourselves to." Dale Holt stepped aside. She brought Marcus breakfast that morning from her own kitchen, biscuits and a jar of preserves and 2 boiled eggs, and she set it on the table between them the same way she had set the water the night before, without ceremony, without waiting for gratitude. He ate with the careful attention of a man who had not eaten a real meal in some time, and she sat across from him and they talked. Not about the law, not about the charges or the judge or the timeline, but about ordinary things. She asked him about the Texas Panhandle, and he described the particular quality of the light there, flat and enormous, Nothing between you and the horizon but grass." She told him about Missouri and the hills, and the way the rivers ran red after rain. He asked about her students, and she talked about them with the specific tenderness of a person who has chosen a calling rather than simply fallen into an occupation. And she noticed the way he listened, not with the polite half-attention of someone waiting for a pause to speak, but with his full focus, his gray eyes attentive, occasionally asking a question that showed he had been following every word. "You actually like them," he said about the children, and there was something in his voice that sounded like the edge of an old wound. "I do," she said, "very much. Why does that surprise you?" "It does not surprise me," he said. "I had a teacher in Texas who liked her students the same way. She was the only person outside of my family who ever told me I was worth something." There was a silence after that, not uncomfortable but full, the kind of silence that settles between two people when something honest has been said and neither wants to cover it with noise. "What happened to her?" Violet asked. "She moved back east after the school was closed. Lack of funding." His jaw tightened briefly. "Same year the bank took our land, it was not a good year." "No," Violet said. "I imagine it was not. She came back every day." The deputies whispered about it, and the town talked, because the town always talked. But Violet Crawford had never particularly modulated her behavior based on what the town said, and she was not about to start. She recognized that what she was doing looked, from the outside, either dangerously naive or scandalously inappropriate. A single woman spending significant portions of her day in the company of the most wanted outlaw in the territory. She also recognized that from the inside, it felt like something quite different from either of those things. It felt like finding something she had not realized she was looking for. By the fourth day, Marcus had told her things she suspected he had never told another living person. He told her about Clara, his younger sister, who had been taken in by a Methodist family in San Antonio after their father died, and who had written him one letter in 3 years. A careful, formal letter that was clearly written in the presence of the people she lived with, and contained no real information about how she was or whether she was happy, only that she was well, and hoped he was too. The letter was folded inside the breast pocket of his coat, and he took it out and set it on the table between them the same way other people set down photographs, with a reverence that made Violet's chest ache. "I cannot write back," he said. "If the letter was traced to her and to that family, it would ruin them." "After this is over," Violet said carefully, "when the truth about Callahan is on record, you should write to her." "After this is over," Marcus said, and the flatness of his voice when he said it told her exactly what he believed the outcome of this situation would be. "You do not think you are going to survive it," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her steadily. "I think the most I am hoping for is that the record shows I did not kill Roy Callahan. Beyond that." He shook his head slowly. Violet felt something rise in her chest that was not entirely rational. It was the same feeling she got when one of her students sat across from her convinced of their own stupidity, when all the evidence pointed in the opposite direction. It was the feeling of knowing something about a person that the person did not yet know about themselves, and it made her press her palms flat against the table and lean forward slightly. "You are not nothing," she said. "Whatever you have done and however this ends, you are not a man without worth. I want you to understand that I mean that specifically, not as a general kindness." Marcus Sheridan looked at her with an expression she would think about for a long time afterward. It was the look of a man who has received something he did not know how to hold, like a gift given to someone whose hands are full. On the 5th day, something happened that changed the shape of everything. A rider came into Dusty Creek from the south, moving fast, and the news he carried ran through the town within the hour. Cutter Voss and what remained of his gang had been spotted 2 days' ride away, moving in the direction of the territory boundary. The territorial marshal's office had dispatched a party of deputies to intercept them, but the rider had another piece of news, whispered in corners and traveling through town like a brush fire. Cutter Voss knew Marcus Sheridan was in Dusty Creek, and Cutter Voss had a reason to want Marcus Sheridan dead before he spoke to any circuit judge. Violet heard this at the general store from Mrs. Holbrook, who had heard it from the writer directly, and she walked to the jailhouse with her heart moving faster than she would have liked, and she told Marcus what she had learned. She watched his face as she spoke, and what she saw there was not surprise. It was confirmation of something he had already suspected. "He will come," Marcus said, "or he will send someone. Cutter does not leave loose ends." "You knew this when you rode into town," Violet said. "I knew it was possible. And you rode in anyway." She stared at him. "Into a town full of people who want to shoot you, knowing that Cutter Voss might follow you here." "I told you. I had run long enough." Violet stood up and walked to the window of the jailhouse, which looked out onto the main street, quiet in the late afternoon light. She pressed her hand against the rough adobe wall and made herself breathe evenly, made herself think clearly, which was what she did when she was frightened, because fear without a plan was useless. "Then we need the judge here sooner," she said. 3 days is too long. I need to send a telegram to Judge Bryce's last known location and ask him to ride faster." "Miss Crawford." Marcus's voice was quiet. She turned to look at him. "If Cutter comes here," he said, "I need you to stay away from this building." "You need me to stay away," she repeated. "He will know that you have been coming here. He will know you are involved." "He does not." He stopped, and something moved across his face that was not the careful control he usually wore. "He does not have a great deal of regard for bystanders." Violet looked at Marcus Sheridan, at the way his hands were braced against the edge of the table and the tension in his jaw, and she understood with complete clarity that he was afraid, not for himself, for her. The understanding of it hit her somewhere below her ribs with a force that was neither gentle nor expected. "I will be careful," she said, "and I will send the telegram today." She sent it, and then she did something else, something practical and entirely in keeping with her character. She went to see the 4 ranchers on the edges of town who had the most men available and the most to lose from Cutter Voss's gang operating in the area, and she made them understand, in the plain, particular way that she had, that allowing Marcus Sheridan to be silenced before he could testify was not in their interest. She did not ask them to protect Marcus out of mercy. She asked them to protect the truth, and the distinction mattered to men who would have rejected the first appeal outright. By nightfall, there were 6 additional armed men positioned around the jailhouse and the surrounding buildings, and Dale Holt, who had initially resisted this arrangement, had come to understand that Violet Crawford had effectively organized a small militia in the space of an afternoon. He stared at her with something that was almost awe. "Miss Crawford," he said, "you are a remarkable woman." "I am a practical one," she said. "There is a difference." She went to the jailhouse that evening later than usual, and when she came in, Marcus was sitting on the cot in the cell rather than at the table, his back against the adobe wall, his knees drawn up, and he looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who was simply tired, not performing anything, not managing the image he projected, just tired in the bone-deep way that comes from years of moving and hiding and carrying too much. She sat down on the chair outside the cell bars, and they talked quietly for a long time. She told him about the arrangements she had made, and he listened with his eyes closed, and when she finished he said, without opening his eyes, "You should not be doing this." "Perhaps not," she said. "I am doing it anyway." "Why?" He opened his eyes and looked at her through the bars, and the directness of his gaze was the same quality she had noticed from the first moment in the street, that complete absence of manipulation or deflection. "You do not know me. You knew me 4 days ago as a name on a wanted poster. I know you now," Violet said. 4 days of honest conversation tells you more about a person than 4 years of careful acquaintance." A long silence fell. Outside, a coyote called somewhere in the hills beyond town, the sound carrying clean and sharp through the night air. "I have thought about what you said," Marcus said. "About worth, about being worth something." He paused. "I do not know if I believe it, but I believe that you mean it, and that is not nothing." Violet looked at him through the bars and felt the particular cruelty of the bars with a clarity that surprised her. She was not the kind of woman who had ever romanticized outlaws or given her trust easily, had in fact been burned sufficiently by a man who had turned out to possess a hidden motive, that she had built the walls of her current life with considerable care. And yet here in this cell with this man, the walls were doing nothing useful at all. "Get some sleep," she said. "We need the judge to arrive and Cutter Voss not to, and both of those things require all of us to be sharp tomorrow." He smiled at her. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it rearranged something in her face that she hoped she had the presence of mind not to let show. "Good night, Miss Crawford," he said. "Good night, Mr. Sheridan," she said, and walked home through the dark. The telegram from Judge Harlan Bryce arrived the following morning. He had received Violet's message and was riding hard. He would be in Dusty Creek in 5 days, not 8. It was not as fast as she had hoped, but it was something. The response from Silver City arrived 2 days later, and it was better. Samuel Dries was in Silver City. He had been located at the copper mine, and when approached by the postmaster's contacts, he had stated with what was described as considerable urgency and apparent relief that yes, he had witnessed the death of Roy Callahan, and no, Marcus Sheridan had not fired the shot. He was willing to testify. He had, he said, been wanting to tell someone the truth of that night for 2 years, and had been too afraid of Cutter Voss to do so. Violet read the response twice and then walked to the jailhouse at what amounted to nearly a run, which was not something she often did, and told Marcus what she had learned, and the look on his face when she finished was the one she would carry with her the longest. It was not triumph. It was not relief exactly. It was the look of a man watching a door that had been shut for a very long time begin, very slowly, to open. "He will testify," Marcus said, as though hearing it again might make it more real. "He has already agreed," Violet said. "The judge will need to arrange for him to be brought here or for a sworn statement to be taken. I have already written explaining that." Marcus sat down on the cot slowly. He pressed his hands together and looked at them for a moment, and Violet recognized that she was watching a private moment, the kind that belongs to a person absorbing something that is too large for immediate expression. She gave him that moment. She sat in her chair on the other side of the bars and waited, and did not fill the silence with anything, which was one of the things she was genuinely good at. "Miss Crawford," he finally said. "Violet," she said. She was not entirely sure where that came from, except that it had become increasingly strange, over the past 5 days of sitting across from this man in varying degrees of honesty and intimacy, to maintain the formality of surnames. He looked up at her. "Violet," he said, and the way he said it was careful, the way you say a word you have been given permission to use but want to be sure you are using correctly. "I do not know how to," he stopped, started again. "No one has done something like this for me since I was 16 years old." "What happened when you were 16? She asked. "My teacher in Texas told the land agent that he was a thief in front of the whole town," he said. "It did not change anything in the end. He still took our land, but she said it. She stood there and said the plain truth of it in public because it needed to be said." He paused. "She was the bravest person I had ever met." Violet met his eyes. "And now," he held her gaze for a moment that stretched long enough that she could feel it in her chest. "Now she is the second bravest," he said quietly. Violet looked away first, not because she was embarrassed, or not only because of that, but because the feeling rising in her chest was large enough that she needed a moment to be sure of its nature before she did anything about it. She was not 20 years old. She was 29, and she had been burned, and she was not in the habit of confusing gratitude for something more significant or allowing the peculiar intimacy of crisis to substitute for the slower, steadier architecture of genuine feeling. She believed in being honest with herself more than almost anything else. And being honest with herself meant acknowledging that what she felt for Marcus Sheridan, sitting on the other side of these bars on the 6th day of knowing him, was not merely compassion or the satisfaction of doing what was right. It was something older and more personal than that. It was the feeling of recognizing a person, the specific and rare experience of meeting someone whose nature speaks directly to your own, across every difference of circumstance and history, and all the things that were supposed to make them strangers. She acknowledged it to herself, and then she put it carefully away, because there was still a great deal standing between this moment and any future in which it could be anything other than a feeling, and she was, above all things, a practical woman. On the seventh night, Cutter Voss arrived. He did not come with his whole gang, which would have been visible from a distance and easily turned back. He came with 2 men, and they came quietly, in the deep dark of 3 in the morning, and they did not come for the jailhouse. They came for Violet Crawford's house. She heard the sound on her porch at something close to 3:30, and she was already awake because she had not slept well in 2 days, and she had the presence of mind to take the small pistol from the drawer of her nightstand before she went to the bedroom window rather than the front door. The pistol was a Remington model 1875, single action, and she had learned to use it in her first year in Dusty Creek from a rancher's wife named Ada Bloom, who had said, with admirable practicality, that any woman living alone on the frontier was a fool if she did not know how to handle a firearm. She looked out the window and saw a man she did not recognize standing on her porch, and a second man in the street, and a third man further back, who was watching the jailhouse from the shadows. She did not panic. She dressed quickly, slipped out the back door of her house, and went directly to the nearest rancher's property, where one of the men she had stationed was sitting awake by a window. She told him what she had seen in under 30 seconds, and he fired his rifle into the air twice, which was the agreed-upon signal, and within 4 minutes there were 12 armed men in the street. The 2 men near Violet's house ran. The third man, the one watching the jailhouse, was caught before he reached his horse. He was not Cutter Voss. He was a hired man named Fletcher who, when made to understand the precise nature of his situation, provided information freely. Cutter Voss was camped 6 miles south. He had more men with him. He had intended for Fletcher and the others to extract Marcus from the jailhouse, in the confusion of whatever happened to the schoolteacher's house, and it took Violet several minutes of very controlled breathing to process the full shape of what had nearly happened. Dale Holt sent a rider to the territorial marshal's office at first light with the information about Voss's location. He also sent a rider toward the direction Judge Bryce was coming from, with the most urgent request he had probably ever written. The judge arrived the following morning, a full day ahead of his revised schedule, gray-bearded and dust-coated, and visibly surprised by the level of organized activity he rode into. Violet met him at the edge of town and briefed him with the efficiency of someone who had been reorganizing the details of this situation in her head all night, and Harlan Bryce, who had been a circuit judge in New Mexico Territory for 11 years and had seen most things at least twice, looked at her with the particular respect that practical competence commands and said, "I understand why you sent for me quickly." The hearing was held in the church, because it was the largest room in town. Every seat was taken. People stood along the walls. Samuel Dries had provided a sworn, notarized statement from Silver City, witnessed by the local sheriff and a justice of the peace, and it was read aloud in its entirety. It stated clearly and in specific detail that Cutter Voss had fired the shot that killed Roy Callahan, and that Marcus Sheridan had not drawn his weapon, had not participated in the shooting, and had in fact been heard by Dries to shout at Voss to stop, a second before the shot was fired. There was a silence in the church when the statement finished being read that was different from the silence in the street a week ago. This silence had something like the texture of reckoning in it. Marcus Sheridan sat at the table before the judge in a clean shirt that Dale Holt had quietly provided that morning, his wrists no longer bound, because the judge had ordered the restraints removed for the hearing. He sat upright and answered every question put to him without evasion or embellishment, and Violet, sitting in the second row with her hands folded in her lap, watched him speak the truth out loud in a public forum for the first time, and thought that there was no beauty quite like the particular dignity of a person refusing to be less than honest. Judge Bryce was thorough. He went through every charge. For the bank robberies and train robberies, there were convictions Marcus did not contest, and penalties were assessed accordingly. The charge of murdering Roy Callahan was formally dismissed in light of the sworn testimony. The judge issued a warrant for the arrest of Cutter Voss on that charge, and for the additional charge of filing a false criminal report with intent to place blame upon an innocent party. The sentence for the charges Marcus did plead guilty to was 14 months in the territorial prison at Santa Fe, with the judge noting for the record that several of the robberies had involved specific and demonstrable targeting of institutions that were themselves under investigation for fraudulent land practices, which, while not a legal defense, was considered a mitigating factor in the sentencing. 14 months, not a hanging, not 20 years. 14 months, and then a life on the other side of it. Violet walked out of the church and stood in the sunlight for a long moment with her eyes closed, and she could hear the crowd dispersing around her and the sounds of the town resuming its ordinary rhythms, and she let herself feel just for that moment the full complicated relief of it. When she opened her eyes, Marcus was standing a few feet away, a deputy on either side of him, watching her. 14 months, she said. 14 months, he agreed. His voice was steady, but his eyes were not quite. I wanted to, before they take me to Santa Fe, I wanted to tell you. He stopped, started again. You are the reason I am still alive. That is not a small thing, and I know that it is not a simple thing to have done. I know what it cost you in this town. It has cost me nothing that I cannot rebuild, Violet said, which was true. There were people in Dusty Creek who would regard her differently now, but there were also people who would regard her with the particular, enduring respect that comes from watching someone act with genuine courage. She had been in this town long enough that the second group was larger. Violet. He said her name with the same careful quality as before, the word given its proper weight. When I come out the other side of this, I am not going to be the same man who rode into town with his hands up. I am going to be, he seemed to be looking for a specific word. Less, he said, less of what I was and more of what I intended to be. I think, Violet said, that sounds like a good direction to travel. He looked at her, and the deputy on his right said quietly but firmly, Mr. Sheridan, we need to move. I know, Marcus said. He did not look away from Violet. Will you? Another pause. I am not in a position to ask you for anything. I understand that. But if you were inclined to write while I am in Santa Fe, he let that sentence stand on its own without finishing it. I am very inclined to write, Violet said. I have a great deal to say, and I have discovered recently that you are someone who actually listens. Something in his face shifted, the faintest possibility of a smile under the weight of everything else. Miss Crawford, he said, falling back to the surname like a gentleman does, I look forward to every letter. They took him to Santa Fe the following morning, and Violet stood in the street and watched the small party ride out, and she stayed there until they were out of sight, and then she went home and sat at her kitchen table and wrote the first letter. She wrote it like she talked, plainly and directly, and without performing anything. She told him about her students, and about the particular quality of the light in the morning when the dust was low, and the sky was the color of a blue jay's wing. She told him that Mrs. Holbrook had started being considerably warmer to her since the hearing, and that Dale Holt had come to her house with a jar of his wife's honey, and an awkward apology that she had accepted without making him suffer through it more than was necessary. She told him about a horse that had gotten loose from the livery and walked directly into the school during arithmetic, which had caused the greatest excitement among her students in living memory. She signed it, after some consideration, simply, Violet. His first letter back arrived 3 weeks later, and it was not what she expected. She had half anticipated something formal, constrained by the consciousness of prison walls and a guard who might be reading every word. It was not formal at all. It was careful and honest in the way she had come to expect from him, and it was also quietly funny in places that surprised her. and it was full of the specific kind of attention to detail that characterized a person who observes the world with genuine interest, rather than using it as a backdrop for their own narrative. He described the prison, not with complaint, but with a clear-eyed accuracy that somehow managed to be neither despairing nor falsely optimistic. He described his fellow inmates with a generosity that she found characteristic. He described the mountains visible from the exercise yard in language that was spare and precise, and made her see them clearly. He said near the end, "I think about what you said, that 4 days of honest conversation tells you more about a person than 4 years of careful acquaintance. I believe you are right. I also think that letters might count for even more than conversation, because you can think about exactly what you mean before you say it. And I have found that I have a great deal to say that I have never before allowed myself to think about directly." She read that line twice and then set the letter down and looked out her kitchen window for a long time. She wrote back the same day. They wrote every week for 14 months. The letters grew longer, and in some ways more carefully considered, and in other ways more unguarded, moving in the way of genuine correspondence between two intelligent people who have discovered each other, in that specific deepening spiral where honesty generates intimacy, which generates the courage for more honesty. She told him about Missouri. He told her about Clara, and about the years before everything fell apart. She told him about the man in Missouri she had almost married, the one with the hidden motive and the double life, and she told it without self-pity, but with the plain facts of how it had changed the way she moved through the world. He told her in return about the choices he had made that he could not unmake, and he did not ask for absolution. He just named them, one by one, clearly, the way you have to name a wound to treat it. She wrote to Clara in San Antonio without telling Marcus she intended to. She wrote as a teacher writing to inquire about a former student, careful not to give too much away. But Clara Sheridan was not a young woman who missed implications, and her letter back, arriving 6 weeks later, was warm and hopeful and contained the phrase, "Tell him I think of him every day," which Violet included in her next letter to Marcus with a note that said only, "I hope you will write to her when you are able." His response to that portion of the letter was a paragraph that said nothing at all about the words, and was instead the most carefully structured absence of emotional response she had ever read, which told her everything. The news about Cutter Voss came in the spring of 1885. He had been apprehended by the territorial marshal's office near the Arizona border, after a chase that lasted 3 days and resulted in 2 of his men being wounded and 1 killed. He was tried in Santa Fe, and the charge of killing Roy Callahan was the one that carried the longest sentence, 25 years in the territorial prison. Roy Callahan's wife, now living in Albuquerque with her son and her own mother, sent a brief letter to Judge Bryce expressing gratitude for the truth being established, and the judge, who had kept Violet's role in the whole affair firmly in view, forwarded a copy of that letter to her. She kept it. Marcus was released from Santa Fe on a Tuesday in November of 1885, 2 weeks before the 14 months had technically run their course, with time credited for consistent good behavior, and for a service he had rendered in preventing an escape attempt that might have cost a guard his life. He had written to tell her the release date 3 weeks prior, a letter that was notably more careful in its word choices than any of the previous ones, as though he was writing around the edge of something large. She had written back, and her letter was also notably more careful, and she had recognized, reading it over before she sealed it, that they were both, at the same time, navigating the distance between a correspondence that had become deeply intimate and a reality that had not yet been tested. She did not know what he intended to do after Santa Fe. She did not know if he planned to come to Dusty Creek or go somewhere else, start fresh in a place where the name Marcus Sheridan was not attached to a story anyone knew. She had not asked, because asking would have been a statement of the thing she wanted, and she was not sure that what she wanted was fair to impose on a man who was walking out of prison into an open future. He appeared in Dusty Creek on a Thursday morning in the last week of November, 1885, and the difference between this arrival and the one 14 months prior was everything you might imagine. He rode in on a bay horse, upright in the saddle, no hands raised above his head because there was no longer a reason to raise them, his hat pulled low against the November wind. He had a small pack behind the saddle and a coat that was better quality than the frayed shirt she had last seen him in, and when he dismounted in front of the general store and looked around at the town, she saw him from the window of the schoolhouse where she was giving an afternoon lesson. She did not run out. She finished the lesson, because it was the lesson, and because her students deserved the full attention they were owed, and because in 14 months of letters she had communicated clearly enough to Marcus Sheridan who she was that she did not believe he would expect otherwise. She released her students at 4 o'clock and walked out of the schoolhouse into the pale winter afternoon, and he was there. He was standing at the far end of the street, looking at the school, and she walked toward him at her usual pace, the pace of a woman who is going somewhere she intends to be. They met in the middle of the street and she looked at him and he looked at her, and 14 months of letters settled between them like cards being set on a table. "You came," she said. "I told you I would," he said. He had said it, in fact, in a letter 2 months prior, in a sentence so carefully embedded in surrounding text that she had read it 4 times to be sure she had understood it correctly, and then had kept the letter under her pillow for a week. "I was not certain," she admitted. "I was certain," he said. "I have been certain of very few things in my life. This was one of them." She looked at him in the thin November light, this man with the storm-colored eyes and the careful hands, and the particular honesty that she had recognized from the first moment, and never been able to set down. He was 31 years old, and he had done things he could not undo and survived things that would have undone a lesser person, and he was standing in the street of her town with the manner of a man who has decided, finally, that he is going to stand somewhere instead of moving on if only she will let him. "You need somewhere to stay," she said. "I do," he said, "and I need work. I can do most things. I have been talking to a man about a position at the livery, and there is a post I heard about at one of the ranches north of town." "There is," she said. She had, in fact, over the past 2 weeks, quietly laid certain groundwork in that direction which was entirely in keeping with her character. "The Aldridge Ranch is looking for a foreman. I may have mentioned your name." He stared at her. "You mentioned my name." "I told Jeremiah Aldridge that you were a man of considerable practical skill and proven honesty," Violet said. "He is aware of your history, and he is of the opinion that a man who rode 300 miles to tell the truth when he could have run is the kind of man he wants managing his operation." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You did that before you knew I was coming." "I did it because I believed you were coming," she said, "and because it needed doing." He looked at her with the expression she had first seen through the jail cell bars, the expression of a man receiving something his hands did not know how to hold. But this time he did not look away, and his hands were not full of anything, and when he reached out and took her hand, it was with a gentleness that was entirely itself, not performed, not hesitant, just present. "Violet Crawford," he said, using her full name the way people do when the name has become something they want to hold carefully. "I wrote you letters for 14 months and I still have not said everything I meant to say." "You have time," she said. Her hand was in his, and the November wind moved through the street, and she could feel the warmth of his fingers through her glove. "I would like a great deal of time," he said, "with you specifically. If that is something you would consider." "Marcus," she said, the way she had said it in letters for 14 months, with the same careful weight he gave her name. "Yes," she said. The winter of 1885 passed in the specific texture of 2 people discovering each other in the unhurried, ordinary way that follows the extraordinary, which is in some ways more revealing than any amount of crisis. Marcus started at the Aldridge Ranch in early December. and it became clear within the first month that Jeremiah Aldridge had made an excellent decision, because Marcus had a natural authority over the working of a ranch that came from having grown up on one, and the men who worked under him responded to the combination of competence and straightforwardness in the way that people generally respond when they are managed by someone who is genuinely good at the thing. He rented a room at a boarding house on the south end of town, run by a widow named Mrs. Espinoza, who was 62 years old and had the gift of seeing past surfaces to the essential nature of a person, and who told Violet, without being asked, that the new man at the Aldridge Ranch was the kind of person you trusted with things that mattered. Violet and Marcus took Sunday dinners together at the hotel when the weather was poor, and at the creek bank when the weather permitted, and they talked the way they had in letters, but with the added dimension of being able to see each other's faces, which turned out to add considerably to the quality of the conversation. There were things his face said that even his honest letters had not quite captured, and she imagined the same was true in reverse, and there was a pleasure in the discovery that was warm and specific, and unlike anything she had experienced before. He met her students at the school Christmas party in December and watched her with them for 20 minutes and then said, quietly, "You were right. You really do love them." She had told him in a letter once that the word "like" did not fully cover it. He had remembered. He always remembered. Clara came to visit in February of 1886, having received a letter from Marcus at Christmas, the first one he had sent in years, that had been followed by a letter from Violet, and then a series of correspondence that had, by the time Clara arrived on the stage from San Antonio, given her a fairly complete picture of the situation she was arriving into. She was 24 years old, small and dark-haired like her brother, but with an openness about her face that spoke of a different kind of experience, and she looked at Violet Crawford for approximately 3 minutes before pulling her into a hug so fierce that Violet laughed out loud from sheer surprise. "He wrote to me about you for a year before he admitted what it actually was," Clara said into Violet's shoulder. "Thank you," she added, pulling back, her eyes bright, "for everything. He would have found his way here without me," Violet said. "Maybe," Clara said, looking at her brother, who was standing nearby with the expression of a man both moved and thoroughly embarrassed. "But you made him hurry up." It was on a Sunday in March of 1886 that Marcus asked Violet to marry him. They were sitting on the bank of the creek, which was beginning to run again with the early spring snowmelt from the mountains, and the afternoon was the particular gold that comes before sunset in New Mexico in late winter, and Violet had been telling him about a disagreement she was having with the territorial board about the funding for a second schoolroom, and Marcus had been listening with his full attention, offering specific and practical suggestions. And then in the middle of a sentence he stopped and looked at her with a directness that was different from his usual directness, more focused, more deliberate, and he said, simply and without preamble, "I would like you to marry me." Violet stopped mid-word and looked at him. "I am not in a position to offer you a great deal," he said, continuing in the way that people do when they are afraid that silence means no. "I have a good position and I intend to keep it, and I have a considerable amount of past attached to me that will follow us wherever we go. I know that is not nothing. I know it asks something of you." "Marcus," she said. "But I love you," he said. "I have loved you since the 5th day in that jailhouse, when you came in and told me about Samuel Dries with your eyes lit up and your voice steady. And I have loved you through 14 months of letters and 3 months of Sunday dinners, and I am not going to stop. And I would rather spend my life building something with you than spend it being careful about not wanting too much." Violet looked at the creek running cold and clear over the stones, and at the mountains behind it dark against the gold sky, and at Marcus Sheridan sitting on the bank with his heart completely visible in his face. "Yes," she said, the same word she had said in the street in November, and it meant the same thing it had meant then, which was not just agreement but the full and chosen opening of a door. He took her hands in both of his, and he kissed her for the first time, there on the bank of the creek in the March afternoon, and it was the kind of kiss that confirms a thing rather than proposes it, the kind that says this is what was true all along. They were married in April of 1886 in the little adobe church in Dusty Creek, in a ceremony performed by the minister who had replaced Dusty Creek's previous minister after the previous one had made a public statement about the schoolteacher's improper involvement with criminals, and found himself faced with a congregation that was, by that point, fairly comprehensively on Violet's side. Clara came from San Antonio to stand beside Violet, and Jeremiah Aldridge stood beside Marcus, and every one of Violet's students sat in the front rows with the particular solemnity of children who understood they were witnessing something that mattered. The reception was held in the schoolyard, because it was the largest space available, and Mrs. Espinoza made tamales, and the Hallbrook family provided a cake, and Dale Holt drank 2 glasses of punch and told Marcus privately that he had misjudged him and was glad to have had the chance to be wrong, and Marcus shook his hand and said he was glad too, and both of them meant it. Violet wore a dress of deep blue that Clara had helped her select from the fabric at the general store, and she had flowers in her hair that one of her students had gotten up at dawn to collect from the creek bank, little yellow things that grew in the wet soil in spring. She did not look like a woman following a script. She looked like herself, exactly herself, standing in the April sunlight next to a man who knew who she was and loved her for precisely that. In the summer of 1886, Jeremiah Aldridge offered Marcus a partnership in the ranch, a gesture of trust that was partly practical, because Marcus had by that point tripled the efficiency of the operation, and partly personal, because Aldridge was the kind of man who recognized when someone had become indispensable and acted accordingly. Marcus came home that evening and told Violet with an expression of contained disbelief, and she was not contained about it at all, and the evening that followed was one of the best ones in a sequence that had grown full of excellent evenings. By the end of 1886, the ranch was doing well enough that they were building a house. It was situated on a gentle rise north of town, with a view of the mountains and a creek that ran through the east corner of the property, and they designed it together in the evenings at the kitchen table of their rented house, Violet with her pen and her schoolteacher's precision and Marcus with his rancher's practicality. And the house that resulted was not large but was exceedingly well considered, with a room that Violet wanted used as a library, and Marcus wanted fitted with shelves which were one and the same, and a porch that faced west so they could watch the sun go down over the mountains. Roy Callahan's widow, Elizabeth, came through Dusty Creek in the autumn of 1886 on her way to visit family in Colorado. She had written ahead, a careful, brief letter asking if she might stop, and Violet had written back immediately and said yes, please. And when Elizabeth Callahan arrived, she was a quiet woman in her early 30s with her young son beside her, and a manner that suggested someone who has walked through a great deal of fire and come out the other side still standing. She and Marcus talked for an afternoon, privately in the front room of the rented house, and Violet gave them that time without hovering. She understood what it needed to be. When Elizabeth left the next morning, she shook Marcus's hand and said, "I am glad you are here. I am glad you told the truth of it." And she said to Violet, "You must be an extraordinary person," and Violet said, "I am just practical," and Elizabeth smiled for the first time and said, "Maybe that is the same thing." The house on the rise was finished in the spring of 1887, and they moved into it on a warm April day exactly 1 year after their wedding, carrying boxes through bright sunlight while Clara, who had by then relocated to Santa Fe and was teaching at a school there, supervised from the porch with the cheerful authority of someone who has no boxes to carry and therefore can freely direct those who do. By midsummer of 1887, Violet knew she was carrying their child, and she told Marcus on a quiet evening on the porch, watching the sunset do its usual extravagant work over the mountains, and his response was to be very still for about 15 seconds, and then to look at her with an expression of such unguarded joy that she felt it somewhere in the center of her chest like a bell being struck. Their son was born in February of 1888, in the bedroom of the house on the rise, with Clara having ridden from Santa Fe to be present, and Mrs. Espinoza, and a capable midwife named Dolers in attendance. He was a healthy, loud, thoroughly opinionated infant from the first hour, which Marcus said was inevitable given his parentage, and Violet said was a significant contribution from Marcus's side specifically, and they named him Thomas James Sheridan, after Marcus's father and Violet's own father, a choice that felt like the right kind of bridge between the past and whatever came next. Marcus held his son on the first night with the same carefulness he used for everything that mattered to him, and Violet, exhausted and quietly triumphant in the way of women who have just done something enormous, watched his face and thought about the man kneeling in the dust of the street. The man who had believed the most he could hope for was that the truth would outlast him. She thought about how wrong he had been about that. "Hello, Thomas," Marcus said to the baby, who was extremely unimpressed but temporarily quiet. "We are going to give you a very good life." "We absolutely are," Violet said from the bed. He looked at her over the small head, and the expression on his face was the one she had catalogued in her mind over the course of 2 years and counting, the one that belonged only to her, the particular quality of being fully seen by a person who chose to stay. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am very all right," she said. "Come here." He came, carrying Thomas with him, and sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she leaned against his shoulder, and outside the window the February stars were sharp and absolute over the mountains, and the ranch was quiet around them, and somewhere in the rooms below the house a fire was burning in the stove, and all of it, every part of it, was real and theirs and hard-won and good. The second territorial board meeting about the expanded school happened in the spring of 1888, and this time the funding was approved. Violet attended the meeting with Thomas in a basket beside her chair, which caused considerable comment and zero actual objection, and she had the budget language amended and the timeline set before Thomas woke up for his midday meal. Dale Holt, who had attended the meeting in a supporting capacity, told Marcus afterward that his wife was the most formidable person he had encountered in 11 years of law enforcement. Marcus said, "I know. I am very aware of this." The new schoolroom was built by autumn, and it was built largely by volunteers from the ranching community, including Marcus himself, who spent 3 Saturdays in a row hammering boards in the September sun, while Violet brought lunch and Thomas was passed from rancher to rancher, with the contented tolerance of an infant accustomed to a great deal of company. Dusty Creek had grown. There were nearly 400 souls in the town now, and the school had 29 students, and Violet had taken on an assistant teacher named Josephine, who was 17 and brilliant, and who Violet intended to support through a proper teacher's certificate program within the next few years. Life in Dusty Creek had a rhythm now, the kind that is not monotonous but is deeply sustaining, the rhythm of days that are full and purposeful and bookended by a house and a person you are genuinely glad to return to. Marcus managed the Aldridge Ranch with a partner's share and a partner's authority, and he managed it well, and his reputation in the county had settled into the kind that is built on consistent daily character rather than dramatic gesture, which suited him better anyway. He was known as a straight dealer, a fair employer, a man who kept his word, and none of that undid the past, but it added to the record, and eventually the record was long enough that the past, while not erased, was no longer the first or loudest thing. There were people in the territory who still remembered the wanted posters. There were towns Marcus would never be fully comfortable in, and conversations that turned sideways when his history came up, and he had learned to navigate those with the same clear-eyed honesty that characterized everything else he did. He did not deny what he had done. he also did not let it be the entire definition. Violet had been right about that in the very beginning. The right to be heard, the right to be more than the worst version of your story, was not a favor extended to the deserving. It was a basic human condition, and Marcus Sheridan, having been the recipient of it, understood its value in a way that was not intellectual but lived. He wrote to Clara every month without fail. When Clara fell in love with a schoolteacher in Santa Fe named Edwin, Marcus rode to Santa Fe to meet him, and came back with a measured approval that took Clara about 5 minutes to recognize as enthusiastic endorsement, with the serial numbers filed off. She was married in the summer of 1888, and Marcus walked her down the aisle with Violet and Thomas in the front row, and Violet spent most of the ceremony with a baby on her hip and an expression of complete satisfaction. Thomas grew, as children do, with the speed that continues to astonish parents no matter how much they have been warned. By the time he was walking, he was already the particular kind of child who has opinions about everything and the vocabulary to express them, which was either a tribute to his parents' combined influence or a warning about the next decade, depending on how you chose to frame it. He was devoted to the ranch horses from an age so early it was almost amusing, and Marcus began taking him to the stables practically as soon as he could walk, lifting him up to touch the horses' noses with a solemnity that suggested they were both engaged in very important business. In the winter of 1889, Violet discovered she was expecting their second child, and this time she told Marcus in the kitchen while he was doing something entirely ordinary, mending a bridle at the table, and he looked up at her and smiled with the whole of his face, the slow particular smile that she had first seen through the jailhouse bars and had never gotten entirely used to in the best possible way. The second child, a girl born in July of 1889, arrived in the same bedroom, again with dolers attending, and Clara arriving in time by a margin that everyone agreed was extremely close. They named her Ellen Rose, after no one in particular and both of them at once, a name that had come to them together over the course of several evenings, and had simply felt right, the way certain things feel right when they emerge from two minds that have learned to think comfortably in the same direction. Ellen was from the beginning the opposite of her brother in temperament, watchful where he was vocal, patient where he was immediate, and with a quality of deep attentiveness that made people feel, even when she was very small, that she was paying close attention to things that mattered. Marcus said, when she was about 6 months old and watching him from her basket with an expression of concentrated assessment, that she had her mother's eyes. He meant the color, which was the same dark amber green. Violet thought he also meant the quality, which would turn out to be correct. By 1890, the town of Dusty Creek had grown enough that the main street had a new hotel, a second dry goods store, and a doctor who had come from Denver, and set up a practice in a building next to the telegraph office. The railroad was coming through the southern part of the territory, not as far north as Dusty Creek yet, but close enough that the idea of it was changing the shape of people's plans and the energy of the town. Marcus had begun to think about what expanded rail access would mean for the cattle operation, and he and Aldridge had conversations that stretched long into the evenings about the future. Violet added a third grade level to the school curriculum and wrote a letter to the territorial board that was, by general consensus, the most systematically irrefutable argument for educational funding that anyone in the office had encountered, and the funding came. Josephine received her teacher's certificate the following spring, and Violet wrote her a letter of congratulation that made Josephine cry in the best possible way. The day that Marcus found the letter was a Tuesday in the autumn of 1890. It had come to the ranch office, addressed to him, from a woman he had not heard from in 6 years, a woman named Hazel who had been the wife of the land agent who had taken his father's property, and who had, it emerged, decided after all this time that there was something she needed to say. The land agent had died the previous winter, and among his papers she had found documentation that confirmed what Marcus had always known but never been able to prove, that the foreclosure of the Sheridan ranch had been engineered through fraud in concert with the bank, and that 3 other families had lost their land through the same scheme. She was writing, she said, because she could not undo what her husband had done, but she could ensure that the record showed it. She had already provided the documents to the Territorial Land Commission and to a lawyer in Amarillo who was working on behalf of the affected families. Marcus sat with this letter for a long time before he showed it to Violet. She found him on the porch in the early evening, holding it, and sat beside him without asking immediately and waited, and when he gave it to her and she read it, she felt the particular quality of a reckoning that has finally arrived at its right destination. "It does not give us back the land," Marcus said. "No," Violet agreed. "It does not. It does not undo any of it, what it cost my father, what it cost Clara, what I did because of it, the paths I took." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. "But it is true, and it is on record." "That matters," Violet said. "I know," he said. He turned to look at her. "You taught me that." She held his gaze, and the evening light was doing what it always did at this hour on this porch, the gold and the purple and the long shadows of the mountains moving east. "You already knew it," she said. "You rode 300 miles to stand in front of a town that wanted to shoot you in order to put a true thing on record. You knew it long before I said it to you." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, the way she had on the first night in the new house with Thomas in his arms, comfortable and grounded and entirely herself, which was how she felt with Marcus Sheridan in a way she had felt with very few people in her life and had begun to think, before he rode into Dusty Creek with his hands raised, she might never feel at all. "I have been thinking," he said after a while. "A dangerous habit," she said. "I've been thinking about Clara's suggestion," he said, and Violet knew immediately which suggestion he meant, because Clara had made it at Christmas, that she and Edwin were looking for land and that she had always wanted to be closer to her brother, and that the territory north of Dusty Creek was beautiful and had good water. "What about it?" Violet asked, though she already had a feeling. "I spoke with Aldridge," Marcus said. "He is thinking about selling a parcel of the north acreage. He is consolidating. If Clara and Edwin wanted it, and if we helped them, they could build on it." He paused. "Thomas and Ellen would grow up knowing their aunt." Violet thought about Clara and Edwin and what it would mean to have them that close, and about Thomas on the morning he had woken up after Clara's last visit and gone directly to her bedroom to find her still there, the uncomplicated joy of it. "Write to Clara," she said. He did. Clara's response arrived in 3 days, which was faster than the post should have allowed, and contained exactly the level of contained excitement that Marcus recognized as his sister being as happy as she had ever been and trying to be dignified about it. Edwin's postscript was 3 sentences of genuine gratitude and 1 sentence of profound practical questions about soil quality, which Marcus found enormously reassuring. The land was purchased in the spring of 1891, and the building began in the summer, and by the autumn of 1891, Clara and Edwin were living a quarter-mile from the main ranch house, and the path between the 2 houses was worn to a clear track within the first month. It was not that everything was without difficulty after that. There were dry years and hard years and years when the cattle market was cruel, and the politics of the territory were complicated, and there were conversations between Marcus and Violet that were not easy, because they were both people with strong minds and clear opinions, and the kind of honesty that does not smooth things over for the sake of comfort. There were nights when the weight of Marcus's history showed in the set of his jaw and the distance in his eyes, and Violet simply sat beside him and did not try to fix it, because some things cannot be fixed, they can only be kept company with. There were moments when Violet's deep-running independence chafed against the ordinary compromises of shared life, and Marcus had learned, with a patience that was genuine rather than performed, to give her room without giving her distance. They were good at it, not because it was easy, but because they had started with honesty and had the sense to keep it. Thomas turned 7 in 1895 and was a source of considerable entertainment to everyone who knew him, horse-mad and question-mad, and possessed of his mother's directness and his father's attentiveness, which was a combination that his schoolteacher, who happened to be Josephine, found both delightful and occasionally exhausting. Ellen was 5 and watching everything, and had decided early in her life that she was going to be a doctor, a conclusion she arrived at after watching the Denver doctor treat her brother for a broken arm following a horse-related incident that did not surprise anyone who knew Thomas, and which she announced to the family at dinner with the finality of someone reporting a fact rather than stating a preference. Marcus and Violet exchanged a look over the table at that announcement, and the look said several things at once, the way looks do between people who have been talking to each other for a decade, and one of the things it said was, "Of course she is," and another thing it said was, "We will make sure she can." In the early summer of 1896, on a Sunday afternoon when the light was doing its best work over the mountains, and the creek was running full and clear, and Thomas was at the stables, and Ellen was reading on the porch, and Clara and Edwin were coming for supper, Marcus found Violet at the porch railing, looking out over the property the way she sometimes did in quiet moments, her hands loose at her sides. Her expression the one that meant she was thinking about something she had not yet decided to say. He came and stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She turned to look at him, and her face was the one he had known for a decade now, the same face he had watched across a jailhouse table in the lamplight, the one that had never hidden anything from him once she decided to stop trying. "I am thinking," she said, "that I used to believe that the most I could hope for was a life that was useful. That made sense. That left things a little better than I found them." She looked back at the mountains. "I did not know that a life could be this." Marcus looked at the view she was looking at, the ranch and the mountains and the road that wound toward town where their children were growing and their friends were living and the school she had built still stood. And then he looked at the woman beside him, who had stepped off a porch and into a street full of armed men to say 2 words on behalf of a truth she believed in, and who had remade his entire understanding of what a person could be. "Neither did I," he said. She took his hand. He held it. The mountains turned gold in the evening light, and the creek ran on below them, and the life they had built held steady around them like a house with good bones, built to last, built by 2 people who had found each other across every impossible distance and decided, with the full knowledge of what they were choosing, to stay. Ellen's voice came from the porch, reading something aloud to herself, the clear, precise voice of a child who loves words, and Thomas's laughter drifted across from the stables, and on the road a small plume of dust announced that Clara and Edwin were coming for supper, right on time. Marcus squeezed her hand. Violet leaned against his shoulder. And the sun went down over the mountains in New Mexico territory, in the year of 1896, in the good gold light of everything that had been fought for and forgiven and found.